Well, good afternoon, and welcome to our first audio and video lecture for uh, Management 404, Leadership and Change. And the first slide, not the first slide, chapter 1. We're going to do chapters 1 and 2 this evening, or late this afternoon and early evening. Chapter 1 is an introduction. And as you know, an introduction is an overview, and you will find in reading chapter 1 that it's a very short chapter. Regardless, we're going to go through this, and in chapter 2 will be, I promise you, a lot meatier. All right, the author of this text, Burke, tells us that the core themes of this text and of hopefully what we're going to go through in this course will be what you see here on the slide. Core themes of any change are planned change versus unplanned change. Now, I want you to think of unplanned change as something that's being forced by outside elements. Revolutionary versus evolutionary. Obviously, we're going to talk about that a lot more, and also planned versus unplanned change. But I don't think we really need to discuss those terms a whole lot. We understand the difference between revolution and evolution. And then probably what the author really homes in on here a good bit. I apologize for the phone ringing. I'm not going to answer it. Organizational continuity, keeping going as we are or as we were, versus external environment discontinuity. So keep those two in mind as we go through both the text and the lecture in this course. Notice what he says here, that most of the information you can get, find, research for, etc., focus on continuity and keeping the status quo rather than discontinuity. And I suppose, and I think we should think about this, that one of the reasons that this occurs is that it is a lot easier for us to think about continuity. We can handle continuity. Continuity is logical. It is progressive. Now, yeah, that's status quo, but it's still progressive. Think about that. Where discontinuity is certainly not. The author also says we need to think more deeply about research and organization change and understanding organization change. Notice he also says, makes what I would consider a self-aggrandizing statement that a lot of people agree with him, and therefore he's come up with this book supporting his ideas, and so he's come up with non-traditional change literature. Now, as we continue here, he gives you some understanding of the sources to understand organization change. He talks about the theory literature that's available, trade literature that's available, and notice he uses organization examples, and then notice he talks about, and I'm going to come back to this in a second, wisdom that comes from consultants, and then storybooks and allegories and combination books, etc. One of the things that I want to mention to you, and I don't remember that Burke actually talks about this in his book, or in the book that we're using, I should say, and that is many organizations hire a consultant to help them with change. And a lot of times the consultant or a team of consultants will come in and they will do some studies and in the organization and prepare a report and give it to the CEO or whoever's in charge. And a lot of times that report will be put in a nice 3-ring binder and go up in the bookcase behind someone's desk and sit there and gather dust. Why does this happen? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Number one, for the most part, consultants only come in and look at the things for which they were hired to look at and provide recommendations for change. In other words, many times the entire organization is not open for the consultants to review. Second is, many people think, and wrongly, consultants are going to come in and change things. Consultants are not going to do that. The people that work in the organization are the ones who are going to do the change. Consultants will tell them what they think needs to be changed, and they'll make some recommendations, but they're not going to do the work. So that's what happens there, and I wanted to point that out to you. And I want to make sure that you understand what I'm saying. I'm not denigrating any consultants. I'm hardly doing that. I'm just telling you what often happens. Now, Burke continues along this line, talking about organization theory, organization change theory literature, again, focusing more on continuity and stabilization. Excuse me, I did not advance my slide. I thought I did and didn't. So here he talks about Kotter's 8-step process for change. I'm not going to focus on all of these. You can read these or in the text, and there's great explanation for them. And I don't need to amplify on that for you, but I want to talk about just a couple of these things. And if you read further in chapter 1 or toward the end, and we'll get there ourselves, he gives a little kind of an example of what he's talking about at his organization. Vision and strategy. Vision comes first, strategy comes second, but people have to first of all understand the vision. What is it we're going to do? Why is it we're going to do that? What is the ultimate goal that we're after? And then there has to be a strategy that follows that. Now, if this is coming from the CEO or from upper management, a strategy doesn't necessarily have to be very detailed, but it does have to do that. It does have to paint the picture in coordination with the vision. Empowering employees. The CEO and upper management are not going to make change happen. The board of directors are not going to make change happen. It is the employees, like I like to say, the rank and file folks, the people who work where the rubber meets the road. All of those adages that we've heard and we've used ad infinitum for many, many, many years. And if we don't give the employees who are going to implement this change the resources that they need and give them some latitude and autonomy, it isn't going to happen. That's just simply the way it is. Generating short-term wins. If the change is an overarching vision, which is radical, let's just use that for an example. Most people cannot absorb that entire concept. It's very difficult. And so if you slice that off into bite-sized chunks and allow people to work on things that are easiest first and can see success, the buy-in is going to be continuous. It's going to be what you want. You're going to get people to do things. They're going to buy into the process and they're going to move along. Now, Cotter again here talks about relationship of lifelong learning, leadership skills, and capacities to succeed in the future. And again, this is a nice laundry list here. Uh, and by the way, that's not a throwaway term. It is a laundry list. It's an important laundry list. But we need to look at some things here and things about competitive drive, lifelong learning. You've heard a lot, or I hope that you've heard a lot, to the new concept of learning organizations. That simply means an organization. Of course, it's employees, because an organization is an artificial construct. And Burke kind of talks about this a little bit later on. We need to be acquiring new knowledge. And not only acquiring that new knowledge, but putting that knowledge someplace, storing it so the members of the organization, the employees, can go back and refer to it and keep that knowledge continuously moving forward. Skills and abilities. This is one of the big bugaboos. If you're going to try to implement change and the current employee staff does not have the skills and abilities, your chances of implementing what you want are between little and nothing. That's very important. And then last down here, competitive capacity. If you're making the change to maintain a competitive place within your industry, you have to be able to do that. And you have to be able to effectively meet your competition, if not be able to neutralize your competition. So you need to be somewhere that you're at least even with your competition. And then, of course, once you've achieved that, for lack of a better term, evenness, then you want to look for something that's going to give you a competitive advantage. Something that will allow you to do things like maintain a higher price than your competitors because your quality is better, because your service is better, because your follow-up is better. All those sorts of things. There's an interesting note about, about Ben & Jerry's, the ice cream maker. Of course, they've gone out by Unilever, a rather large multinational corporation. But Unilever has left Ben & Jerry's alone. And one of the things it talks about Ben & Jerry's is that they can charge a higher price for their ice creams simply because people see them as a good corporate social steward, concerned about the environment, giving back to the community, etc. So this is what this is talking about, and that turns out to be a competitive advantage to Ben & Jerry's. Now he introduces Malcolm Gladwell. And notice that Gladwell's theory, a theory of how change occurs, contagiousness. And what do I want to say about contagiousness? Well, if you're a healthy person and you're put in a room and you've not been immunized against this with a number of people that have measles, I use that because there's been an outbreak of measles in the United States this year, or cases of measles reported, an increased number of cases reported. The chances of you becoming infected from the other people who are contagious, meaning they can pass that along to you, is going to be very high. So you want to create this atmosphere of contagion where other people will take this on and take ownership of the things they need to help to change. Small changes, we talked about this before. We don't need to repeat that. Notice the next one. And what Gladwell says is that change occurs quickly. And it's like an aha moment, not always and continuously. Now, when I say that, we don't want to denigrate continuous change. There are companies that that model their business on continuous change. But notice it's continued. What they do, though, pardon me, is continual change, and it's not. This is taking out this gradual piece. Gladwell also talks about what he calls as the law of the few, and he says because you need a few people to both facilitate and initiate change. Could be the same people doing both. It could be different people doing one or the other. It could be some, again, doing both, some only doing one or the other. So he says you need connectors, you need mavens, and you need salespeople. So he uses the term maven here a little bit differently than I think most of us would. Most of us think of mavens as being somewhat zealous. And at least if they're not zealous about the end state, they're zealous about what they're doing, and they're zealous about this concept and this theory, etc. But he uses them as facilitators, and that's fine, just as long as we understand what it is that Gladwell is saying. The last bit, if you don't have people out there promoting this, I'm using the term promoting as opposed to selling, although that can be, we can do both of those. These are people who are evangelists in a way. And I don't mean to tread anybody's religious views, nor do I mean to demean evangelism. But that's what you need. You need people to be able to carry the message forward and to be, imbued in the message, convinced of it, convinced of its necessity, and convinced that not only is it necessary, but if we don't do this, we're doomed. Gladwell continues by using what he calls the stickiness factor, using different ways to communicate. All this simply means is you want to tell the same story to the same people in a number of different ways so the message resonates. And if it resonates, it should stick. It's not that we don't want to keep hearing this, or we have to change this so it doesn't affect people. It's telling the story a little bit differently each time and coming back to the salient point or points so people look at it differently. I've used an analogy in other classes, and I may have used it here. I remember when I was in the Army, I'd watched the training film, but that's for lack of a better term. I'm not going to be too explicit about this. I guess about 10 or 12 times. Almost had gotten to the point where I was tired of watching it. One of the reasons I was tired of watching it, not because it wasn't important, not because I didn't believe in the message, but because the general who delivered the training film spoke in a monotone. Now, he was a very, very good person. He was a forward thinker, and he had a lot to do with training and doctrine in the Army for a number of years, but he spoke in a monotone. And it was almost enough to put you to sleep. Well, I won't say it's the last time, pardon me, I saw the training film, but I saw it about the 11th or 12th time, maybe 13th or 14th, after I'd been promoted. And now his message didn't change. I mean, we'd had this training film out 4 or 5 years, but he said things to me that I heard differently because now I'd been promoted. I was in a new position of authority, or I had different responsibilities, or both. And so that's what this is, telling it differently in a way so that people get the message more than once, but the message hasn't changed. Again, Gladwell continues here, or probably more appropriately, Burke continues with Gladwell. He talks about the power context, determining what people have to do. And he uses the magic number of 150. And I have to be very honest with you, I've not seen this number used before. But what Gladwell is saying is that we can, in our minds, associate with 150 different people. Once we get past that magic number, according to Gladwell, we're going to have problems. And so the next slide here, we'll see what Gladwell says. Here he talks about the power context, social capacity. He refers to Dunbar. And as more people join the group, he says the number of relationships increases exponentially, obviously. And that the 150 is a maximum that you can know and integrate with and associate with and be able to relate with. Now, again, I don't have any experience with this number. And I will take it on both Gladwell and Dunbar's authority. But it is an interesting concept. Again, with Gladwell, he talks about transactive memory. If we get to know people well, we can interact with them. And he talks about joint memory systems, etc. And it just helps us. It's a facilitating type thing. Now, as I mentioned to you earlier, this is a short chapter. I have just a few slides that I'm trying to share with you. And excuse me, I kind of got lost here a second. Get back on the right track. And we're going to summarize here, but we're going to come to a very nice slide next after this one. And here Burke says these are the sources for organizational change. And notice the number of fields they cross. Organizational psychology, organization and management theory, organizational behavior, which some of you have already taken, the life sciences. Mostly, I think he uses life sciences because he talks about change being an open system, and he sort of associates that with an organism, which would be, we'd think about biology for the most part. Chaos theory, I think we should know what that is just by the term. And the theory there is that things don't get done until you're at the edge of chaos. And the chaos drives many of us to do certain things. And then finally, nonlinear complex theory. And the reason he brings this up, and we'll talk about this when we get to chapter 2 in a few minutes, is that many people think that change is linear. Now, let's stop and think about that. Why would we think change is linear? Well, something that's linear follows logical progression. And that's easy for us to understand. It's easy for us to grapple with. It's easy for us to come up with the correct solution due to linearity. But we don't live in a linear world. And so we need to understand that. And we need to understand that it's good for us to, in my term, embrace complexity, because that's what we face on a daily basis. Now, we don't make change every day. We might do some, but we don't make change that's radical. We don't make change that is revolutionary on a daily basis. Most of us, if we make change incrementally. We make change evolutionary, or in an evolutionary process, perhaps is a better way to put that. And evolution does follow some type of law. Now, please don't argue with me that Darwin's theory is just that, a theory, unproven. If we look at some evolution, and I'm not going to get into anything that tramples on religion, but if we look at how some evolution has taken place, we can see that it tends to be linear. The ones that don't tend to be linear are ones where we have problems. And that comes into defects and things of that nature. So let's finish this chapter 1 on what Burke refers to as case study principles. And let's look at the 5 points that Burke makes here. First, he talks about external environment. And here we're talking about outside elements forcing or causing change. Now, if you read chapter 1, and Burke uses this, and he alludes to the change that one of the vice presidents at Columbia University, but more specifically Teachers College within Columbia University, was envisioning. And he mentioned that Teachers College, like a lot of universities, is dependent upon tuition. And so what he was saying is that if Teachers College did not update their facilities, they probably were going to lose students. And notice if you read that at the end of chapter 1, only about a page and a half, maybe 2 at the most, there was resistance to that. And we'll talk more about both external and external environment in both chapters 2 coming up next and chapter 15. Need. See the future, and it must be painted. And at the same time, a sense of urgency of getting to the future has to also be articulated. So there's 2 things. You got to paint the picture of the vision. I'm using paint, some people need it painted, some people can see it in their minds. So, you're going to do that. And then urgency, why is it we need to get there? So one has to complement the other. And we'll talk more about need in chapter 5. Consequences. Change does not occur as planned. We need to realize that. Why? Because as we're going through change, we may find that a change that we want to implement, because of our linear thinking, causes us to change something we had not intended to implement. So we need to stop and think about what are the consequences of the change. Now, I'm here to tell you that most times people don't do that. They don't think of the consequences. So that's a decision-making process. And in the decision-making process, we evaluate the alternatives and the potential consequences of each alternative. And then we choose the best, the one that gives us the biggest payback. We're going to talk more about consequences in chapter 2 as well. Resistance, the old bugaboo of any change. No human that I know or have ever known likes them, but obviously that's not millions. It's probably not even thousands. Most of us are very reluctant to change. We're creatures of habit. We like what we do. We're comfortable doing what we're doing. You want to look about the old statement about being comfortable in his or her own skin. That's what we're talking about. And so there will be resistance to change. Every resistance won't be the same. Some people will resist for different reasons. And we need to think about that and talk about that. And we'll talk about resistance to change in chapter 6 and again in chapter 16, which is the end of the text. And then finally, change leader role. One of the things that we're talking about here, and Burke uses a term, and I'm going to use a little bit different term, but actually means the same thing, and that is the change leader must be open. He or she must be clear about what's to be gone and hold nothing back. We can't put things in reserve. We'll talk about this later. No, can't be done that way. Now, you might be able to say, we'll address this step after the first 5 or 6 steps are going to be completed. Yeah, that's okay. But you need to be open so that people understand it, and there's an amount of trust that goes with this. Very, very important. And we'll talk about openness in chapters 13 and 14. Well, we have come to the end of chapter 1. I'm going to get the slides up for chapter 2 and take a short couple-minute break here to catch my breath and take a drink of water, and we'll be back. Thank you. And it'll be just a few minutes before we get into chapter 2. All right, pardon me, it's 5:03, we're back. Chapter 2 is Rethinking Organization Change. So let's have a look here and see what Burke happens to say. One of the things that we have to think about, and is probably the most important, is that often when we talk about change, we're going to have to talk about changing organization culture. And that's very, very, very difficult to do, as Burke points out here in his first bullet, because we're upsetting an apple cart. We're turning things on end, and what it may mean is not only this change in culture, but it may mean many people are going to lose their comfort zone, and that's difficult to deal with. And this is what here, the next one. Notice this next statement, and you can think about this when, and this comes up in the resistance. Why are we changing when we're making profit? Why are we changing when we're the best that there is? Well, let's stop and think about this for a second. How many of you have ever owned a Kodak product? Most of you are a good deal younger than I am, maybe have never owned a Kodak product, have never taken a old-time traditional photograph or picture. And so why am I saying this about Kodak? We don't think much about Kodak. The fact of the matter is that Kodak had a lot of the technology that we have today, or at least the elements of the beginnings of that technology, and chose not to use it. Who is the leader in electric cars today? Well, I don't know that it's General Motors, but General Motors had the technology for electric cars back in the 1990s and scrapped it because oil was cheap. Where would they be today when people are clamoring for alternative fuel cars? And notice his last statement. We don't have all the information we need to have to plan and then implement the change. Here, Burke talks about the paradox of plan change. And again, remember, we talked about this before, that we think of change as being linear. Here's our big picture. We have 10 steps to implement. Each of the steps might have sub-steps, but let's just use 10. 10's an easy number to keep in our mind. And so we go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. But as Burke says, this is actually the change that we see. We're down here where we started at what Burke calls the beginning point or launch. Here's where we want to be at the end. And look at the loops we went through. So we need to understand that. Problem is, we don't. Now, Burke alludes to changing corporations, and he cites Foster and Kaplan. And there's a good deal of information about Foster and Kaplan in the lecture notes posted for week 1 on Campus Web. And I certainly suggest that you read that, because that's going to help you understand or put greater meaning for yourself in this change context between the PowerPoint slides that we have that I'm using to speak to and what we have posted on Campus Web for lecture notes. What he says here is, notice that markets, he talks about capital markets here. I think that probably the best way to look at that is securities markets would be like the stock exchange, the selling and buying of other types of securities like bonds. They outpace corporation change or corporate change or any other type of change, if you will. Why? Well, for the most part, the changes in the market are unplanned. Most people don't maybe not think about that. Now, you know, I'm not talking here about people that get into program buying, et cetera, et cetera. You know, they work with a broker or they work with a mutual fund company. They say, I want to buy X shares of stock of this particular fund or this particular stock on the 15th of every month. And here's the amount of money I want to use. You can take it from my bank account or I'll send you a check, whatever they do. But that's a hedge against what the market's going to do. The thought process is, if you do this, you'll buy sometimes when the price is high, you'll buy a lot of times when the price is low, and it should even out. But as we've seen in the last several weeks, markets are highly volatile, and they change dramatically at the drop of a hat, maybe even quicker than the drop of a hat. So notice this next thing here. Long-term survival is discontinuity for capital markets, but continuity for corporations. And if you think about that, there has to be a disconnect there. And if you read some of what Burke has here in his text in chapter 2, and read the lecture notes posted for week 1 on Campus Web, you'll find out that corporations that stressed continuity haven't done well over the long haul. Now, haven't done well is relative. They're still in business. They're still making a profit, but they're not quite at the level that they need to be if they had been looking at discontinuity. And so the last thing Burke says is that corporations need to abandon this mantra and focus on continuity. Now, this slide simply says, and it goes back to some of what we said at the end of chapter 1, or at the end of the slides of chapter 1, is that outside elements are a driving force in change, and we need to adapt to the change. The Kodak element. Now, the example of of GM that I gave you is not quite the same, because as we know, GM does sell an electric car called the Volt. If you don't know that, I'm sure that you do. And the Volt also comes with a gasoline engine, so if you get to the end of your life of electric power, you can motor around for a little bit further. So we need to be aware of the external environment. We need to be aware of the things that the external environment is pulling us to do. Now, here is where Burke comes in, and he's going to talk about here a little bit more about this. Notice the choice of metaphor, using metaphors to explain change. And he quotes Morgan, who illustrated using metaphors to describe organizations, gives us some thought process. And as if you read the text, it talks about, well, we could say it's about machinery, and it's about equipment, and it's about buildings, and it's about land, and it's about a few other things. But it doesn't really explain everything. We get the thought in our minds, we get the concept in our mind, but it doesn't really explain everything. And why doesn't it explain everything? Because an organization is a construct. If you take people, machines, land, buildings, inventory, all of that out of an organization doesn't exist. So an organization is an artificial construct. We said this is what an organization is. Now, let's look at this differently. If you take off my arms and my legs, my ears, and I've lost my sight, I'm still a human. Those are all parts that help make up my body. But I'm still a human. Now, yeah, if you take out some other things, I'm going to cease to be a human as we know a human. But I'm still a human because people can look at me and see and touch and feel, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So that's why he talks about metaphor. And he, again, quotes Morgan with the metaphor. All right, excuse me, I'm not moving my slides correctly. I'm a little confused here. So, Burke likes to use, and Morgan uses the organism as a metaphor. Notice that an organism has interaction. Every organism, every living organism, has an interaction with some other organism to keep going. And if it doesn't have that interaction, it's not going to survive. And so notice that what the primary objective of any organization is survival. Now, it has to survive, because otherwise, if it doesn't survive, it won't make profit. So the primary objective cannot be profit. The primary objective has to be survival. If it doesn't survive, it won't make a profit. Now, sure, the ultimate objective is to make a profit, but the primary objective has to be survival. Doesn't survive, it's not going to be able to make a profit. It's not going to be around. Now, Burke says there are 4 limitations of the organism as metaphor. And this goes back to part of what I said before. You know what an organism is because you can reach out and grab an organism. An organism can be felt, touched, well, same thing. Maybe there's some aroma to it, smell, can be seen, etc. It's the 5 senses can do something with an organism. An organization's social construct. Now, notice here, this suggests that organizations depend on their environments for survival, but they also act on and influence the environment. Now, most organizations do a better job of influencing the internal environment than they do the external environment, but they still do have an influence on the external environment. And if we think not, all we need to do is listen to folks that say, you need to stop polluting. You need to stop using so many natural resources. You need to be good stewards of the environment, et cetera, et cetera. Organisms, as we know, or at least I hope we know, I realize everybody's not a biology person, but I think we probably know this from basics, are made up of interdependent operating systems. That's my term. And they're going to work for the good of the whole. He uses here the body. We can say that the heart is an organism in itself, lungs are organisms in and of themselves, etc. But one needs the other. And notice that there is harmony between organisms if there is not. I'm going to use an example to show you in a second. At least I hope I can. If there's not harmony between organisms, then there's going to be disaster. And that's what happens when a person gets a disease that, or an illness that is not necessarily incurable, but is difficult to cure. We think of cancers, we think of leukemia, and we think of other type things. Because what happens here now is the organisms are not compatible. And you have a cancerous organism. Cancers usually are made up of cells that is competing unnaturally against the rest of the organisms. And notice it says that here that most organizations don't operate in the similar type of harmony that organisms do. And then finally, and I don't like to do this, but I want to do this because I think we need to get this in our minds, and I'm doing it for myself as well. The parallels between an organism and an organization may become an ideology rather than a guide. So we don't want this to be imbued. Boy, I'm just going to grab this thing. I'm going to say, that's my mantra. The organization is just like an organism. No, we want to use it as a guide to help us formulate and implement change. Now, Burke goes on to talk about open systems and open system theory, and he says it was derived from biology. And he says that his theoretical viewpoint is that the life sciences are more relevant to understanding organizations and change than those of the physical sciences. Now, we spoke a little bit about this before, but we'll talk about it. I'm not going to talk about it at great length here, but types of organization change. And we have, if you would look at it from this point of view, the more, well, I don't want to use the word revolutionary, but the more, let's use influential. tends to be on the left. The more status quo tends to be on the right. So if you want to use a different analogy, the ones on the left exert greater emphasis and greater cause and more energy, or they require more energy than the ones on the right. These are the primary levels of organization change. And there's no surprises here. Individuals, groups, and the organization itself. He refers to it as the total system. So it sets something that we need to think about and then how we're going to go through each of these, because each of these is separate and it has to be thought of as separate. Notice what he says here, and I don't think we find anything that is out of the ordinary here. Change affects each of those groups we talked about differently, and it changes differently at whatever particular function we have, and then it changes depending upon the level of the function. So what this is telling us is, and we should get this in our minds, is that change itself is different. It affects things differently, and we must understand that if we're going to be able to be successful in implementing change. Now, he's going to speak to each one of these a little bit differently. What he's talking about in this particular slide goes back to what we talked about a little bit in chapter 1, and we had a slide where we talked about skills and abilities. What this is talking about, making sure we have the people in place to be able to make the change that we want to make happen and happen the way we want to make it. Notice what it's talking about recruiting. It's talking about coaching. It's talking about counseling. It's talking about mentoring. It's talking about all of those types of things that we have to do to make sure we have the level of individual, quote unquote, employee to be able to do what it is that we want to do. At the group level, it's what it says here. Here we're talking about building teams. And we may even be talking about implementing self-directing work teams. Self-directing teams are teams that do everything for themselves once it's given a task. It plans the work, it, hires the people it needs to hire, passes out rewards, etc. And really, once it's up and running, doesn't get much help from supervision, using a term, or management, unless it asks. And a lot of organizations and upper level management have problems with self-directed teams because now the management is not needed. Management's not integral to what these folks are doing. They're not rely on management. They take care of themselves. And here at the system, the total system, the organization itself, the focus here is on vision, mission, strategy, culture, and perhaps the structure of the organization. All things are very important here. But if you want to look at, and going back, individual and group, those are really at the micro level. That's at the worker bee level. Now, when I use that term, that's not to be a term that I'm denigrating anybody or downgrading anybody. No, it's just meant to be, that's how I perceive it. This is at the macro level. This is where policy is set. These are the people who are charged with having the mission and vision and strategy for the organization. The folks down below, this overarching strategy, folks down below are tactical people. They're putting the strategy to work. Now notice what Burke says here, that the only way you can change culture, this is something that, remember, is ingrained. It's something that we who are employees of the organization have grown up with. We have to change behavior. And only by changing behavior will we get the desired end results. We're not going to get it otherwise. We have to change behavior. Now, don't think of behavior as being a good boy or good girl versus being a bad boy or a bad girl. No, this is behavior, maybe perhaps the way you do tasks, the way you become a good corporate citizen, things of that nature. So yeah, it could be changing ethical values in some respect, although that shouldn't have to be made, but it could be. But it's more focused on task. Now Burke moves here to what he calls content and process of organization change. Content here, again, we're talking about mission and vision and overall direction, purpose, strategy, values, etc. As we can see, it's on this slide. So that's our content. And the process, very simple. How do we do what it is that we're supposed to do to make this change happen? And you know, if you want to look at it in this fashion, we can go back to a little bit of an analogy I used before. This is strategy. The change is strategy. And the tactical part is how we're going to implement that strategy. And then notice the last part. Once we have it implemented, how we're going to sustain it. Now we're going to talk about Kurt Lewin's thought about change as we get a little further into the text, and there's other theories. Lewin is probably well, he may not be the most famous today about change. He's the one I'm most familiar with, but Lewin has, and his theory's been around for a long period of time. So there are newer ones, but the author here Burke does spend a good bit, spend a good deal of time talking about Kurt Lewin and his change theory. Now this just talks about organizational models. And what I like to talk about organizational models here, maybe something differently than what Burke says, is let's think about these things as roadmaps or as blueprints. We know how to use that as a model. Now, probably a roadmap is a little bit better than a blueprint as an analogy, although roadmap does give us direction, etc. But we use that as a model of something. A blueprint can be used as a model as well. A blueprint tends to be specific about a particular item is to be constructed, etc. But we say it's a model, and it's a guideline, and it gives us some kind of way to put what we want to do into perspective based upon that model that we're going to use. Now notice what he says here, that models are used to simplify things. help reducing the number of parts that are needed. And I like the last part of this, that using a model helps us keep perspective. Now, he doesn't say it that way, but that's what I'm saying. Perspective. It keeps us within the boundaries that we need to be within, as opposed to going outside. Now, when I say that gets me back to, okay, well, now we're linear, we're inside a box that has 4 sides, etc. Well, I don't mean it that way, but it helps us it gives us perspective. It helps us with our thinking because we have something that's been used and proven to be successful. Does that mean that we have to follow it? No. What it means is it's a guide and it can help us. And this just kind of brings out a little bit more about what we were saying about help us. It uses the word focus. It lets us home in on what it is we need to do. Now, there is a thing that's used, I shouldn't say a thing, it's a tool that's used by many people and organizations. It's called a PERT chart. There's also a thing called a critical path method, in which things can be laid out and tell you what change has to be done, what step of the change has to be done at a certain period of time. Those are PERT charts, and Gantt charts are used in management quite frequently, most often used by both engineers and architects. But it helps you channel what it is that you're doing. It shows you what is the most critical thing to do, what needs to be finished first, what other things are fall into place after a particular step is completed. So you don't have to use a PERT chart or Gantt charts, another thing, or critical path method, but all these things are models that help you understand what you're doing. Now, I can't tell you, pardon me, that I've seen a PERT chart used as a model for organization change, but I submit to you it could be. Now, notice what he says here, whatever model you're going to choose. And is the theory grounded? People been able to use the theory and been able to replicate it? Does research back up its claims? Does it have the most current information, key factors? Does it follow this? Now, and last, and perhaps most important, is the model prescriptive or is it descriptive? If it's descriptive, it simply lays something out. Prescriptive means you have to follow what it's saying. Medicine's a prescription. Take 3 times a day or 4 times a day or once a day, whatever it happens to be. So we need to look at that, and you have to determine which of those two that you want to follow. You want to be prescriptive, you want to be descriptive. Obviously, one is a little bit more restricting than the other. Now, we're here at our final slide, and notice what he says. The change has to be based upon data, and it has to be measurable. That simply means, and I'm going to talk about the data part as much as I'm going to talk about the measure part, and that simply means that you have to have some metric in place to be able to measure the effectiveness of the change. And if you can't do that, then the change is meaningless. And then notice the last part here, he says, and this is a given, you have to have total buy-in from everybody. Now, he specifically talks about senior executives and top management, and that's critical, of course. Let's go back to the example that he used at the end of chapter 1, where the vice president of Teachers College said, we need to renovate our buildings and bring them up to 21st century standard. And right away, one of the department chairs stood up and said, boy, you're going to cause us a lot of chaos here, et cetera, et cetera. Notice that the vice president didn't get defensive, didn't back down, showed the vision, and he also said, yes, he understood there would be some short-term pain, but the long-term outcome was going to far outweigh the short-term pain. And that's what we're talking about here. You don't have buy-in from senior leadership, it isn't going anywhere. It's as simple as that. Well, I would like to thank each of you for your attendance here either tonight, and I don't think we had anybody check in. Hopefully you'll get a chance to view this tomorrow or sometime at your leisure, and then give me some feedback on what you liked and how we can change this and what will make it better for you. Now, next week we are going to discuss just chapter 3, but it's an important chapter. We're going to do a little bit of talking about scientific method, which was developed, or scientific management, excuse me, by Fred Taylor at around the turn of the 20th century, into the Hawthorne experiments, etc. Now, what I plan to do is to give you some information about both scientific management and the Hawthorne studies and experiments that you may not have gotten before. Not so much that it's very important for you, but to give you some deeper understanding into what occurred both with Fred Taylor and his famous experiment with Schmidt, the pig hauler, and then what Elton Mayo and his colleagues found at the Hawthorne Electric Plant, at the Western Electric Plant in Hawthorne, Illinois. So I want to thank you for your attention for the last about hour and 10 minutes, and I look forward to speaking with you again next week. Thank you and good night.